I'm really, really happy to see so many of you here. We're fully booked. But I think there's maybe 2 spots left if we have some people outside waiting. Okay. Just a brief introduction. I'm Marie Persson and I work for the Food Climate Research Network based at the University of Oxford. And we are an interdisciplinary international network that work with the links between food, climate, and wider sustainability issues. And as you might know, there was a Nobel Prize award ceremony a couple of days ago. And in connection with this, there was something called the Nobel Week Dialogue. And this year's theme was Your Plate, Our Planet, discussing the future of food. And we thought that it was very apt to continue this discussion with this event, Changing What We Eat. And to answer the question of how to change what we eat, we think that it's very important to think in transdisciplinary ways and collaborate between sectors and disciplines. And so that's why we've gathered you here today. We know that we have a great diversity of people in the audience and in the panel, the people that are going to present. And so we are looking forward to very interesting conversations today. We're also really pleased to be co-organizing this event with 3 great partners. Domo Visions, where we are today. We have SLU, Future Agriculture Program, and Art and Science Initiative represented by Ida and Eliel. And I think you wanted to say something about Domo Visions.
Yes, I'm Björn Nordberg, and I'm the curator of Domo Visions. And I wanted to say something because everybody is always asking, what is this for a building? Where am I? And how long is it going to stay here at the KTH campus? So, this is a collaboration between KTH and NCC, the construction company. And it's an arena, a platform for discussions about sustainability and about innovation. And we've been here for 1 year, and we're going to be here for 1 year more. We create different kind of seminars, talks, this kind of events, exhibitions, performances, concerts, everything. So it's both culture, science, and everything is about a future sustainable society. I will be here around, so if you have any more questions about this venue, you just contact me. Any ideas, you can just grab me when I'm here. Okay?
Okay. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming along, and also thank you for putting up with it all in English, since I think everyone in this room is Swedish, apart from me and maybe Eliel. It seems very strange, but yeah, thank you. And it's also a real pleasure to be here because the arts and design communities are very close to my heart, partly because I come from an arts background and partly because my family is full of architects. So this is something that I'm sort of very personally interested and involved in. But working mainly with scientists, their view on arts and designs is we do the work and then we get them to do the comms. And this is absolutely not what I hope today is going to be about. It's about trying to integrate in the co-production of knowledge and perspectives and futures. So what I'm going to sort of start with is give a bit of an overview of where I think we are when it comes to some of the research and some of the whole gaps in knowledge, but also in perspective. And you'll see this slide is really trying to make the point that food, the reason why the Nobel Week Dialogue was packed with 1,300 people is that everyone's interested in food, because food is so personal, but it's also so political, and it's about everything really. It's a way in to thinking about the world and where we want to go. So this is where the science has perhaps traditionally been most comfortable. We know that the food system as a whole has these major environmental impacts: water use, biodiversity loss, land degradation, deforestation, and so forth. We also increasingly know that the way we produce and distribute and consume food is making us sick. We have the inequalities of twin problems of hunger and overconsumption, as well as micronutrient deficiencies, which result not from not having enough to eat, but the wrong types of food to eat. We have populations in change, which have huge implications for our food system as people move to cities, as populations age in some parts of the world, meaning a less vigorous workforce, but still very young populations with high and rising birth rates in sub-Saharan Africa, placing more pressures on land use. And we have inequalities of trade and forces of globalization and all the counter forces that we're seeing with, for example, Brexit and that little matter of America. And but this part is perhaps the least explored. Because food is something that we do, you know, three, 4 times a day. We eat. It's at the heart of all our religious ceremonies. It's so core to our tradition and our identity. It brings in all sorts of ethical dimensions, ideas about justice. It's a pleasurable thing we do, but this side of things is always discounted in the science, and I think that's a huge mistake, partly because it's important in its own right, and partly because we're never going to develop a more sustainable food system if we ignore this dimension of things. So I just wanted to give you a bit of an overview on how I think the thinking has developed. I've said it's how I think my thinking has developed, but I think it's the way that a lot of people have started to move in thinking about food systems. So I've been working on the kind of food and environmental side of things for actually longer than this, but when I started the Food Climate Research Network, the focus was on this, on how does the food system contribute to climate changing emissions and how can we reduce them. And a lot of that work was actually being done in Sweden. So Sweden and the Scandinavian countries were, you know, the inspiration behind quite a lot of this, because it was the early days of life cycle assessment. And then gradually there started to be this realization that if we're going to address food emissions, we have to focus not just on production, like cleaning up transport or efficient manufacturing or more efficient agricultural systems, but looking at the driver of production, which is, of course, consumption, what it is we eat. And there was this growing understanding that meat had this major impact. So, okay, so we need to shift our consumption patterns, but what are the implications for other areas of concern? What's the relationship with health? What's the relationship with animal welfare? Some forms of emission reduction could have a negative impact on animal welfare and so forth. And so you get these different studies producing these different conclusions, but depending on the focus of the study, there were different prioritizations. So you have all these concerns, you have animal welfare, you have jobs and livelihoods, you have different visions of what the countryside looks like, you have greenhouse gas reductions on the one hand and water saving on the other, and all these different priorities, and people rank them differently, and they have different ideas of what a good system might look like. So I think that's where we are today. We have all these competing narratives about what the priorities are, with different ideological foundations. And I think, so NGOs will argue one thing, businesses will argue another, policymakers will equivocate between the two of them. And I think the focus now is to try and understand where we're coming from as individuals or as organizations, and what the ideological foundations of that are, and to see how we can bridge differences and collaborate for change. And I think that's where the arts and the design communities could play a really important role. So I also just wanted to show this just to really make the point that I'm sure you're very well aware of, that food is 30% of current global annual greenhouse gas emissions. So if we are to meet our Paris climate targets, which is keeping to no more than a 2-degree rise in temperatures, that's the emission space we will have to squash all our human activities into. And if we're going to meet that 1.5-degree target, which is the more ambitious aspiration, we may have to do something very, very miraculous involving negative emissions. But the main point to note here is that we do not have a hope in hell of actually meeting either of those targets unless we do something about our food system. So what can we do? Well, we can produce differently, and that has, as I said, traditionally been the focus of activity. We can, what I say, share out differently. So that includes things like reducing waste, but it's also, as again you will all know, there is enough food in the world to feed everyone. The reason why people go hungry is because they cannot afford it. So it's about getting the prices right, ensuring access to food in local markets. It means dealing with things outside the food system, like employment, like transport connections, like refrigeration, and food storage rather. So it means trying to make sure that it's all distributed effectively. But we also need to consume differently, and that, as will become manifestly clear, and as you're all very familiar with, means cutting back on meat consumption. And again, I've been working on these issues for quite a long time now, and wherever I go now to give a talk, I don't really know anybody who doesn't realise that meat is an issue. And that's new, that's changed, and I think that's very encouraging, although we haven't actually got to the stage of shifting consumption. So what does the eating differently look like? Well, the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, has a definition of sustainable diets that you may all have seen and that you could not possibly disagree with. It looks great, but I don't know really what this looks like on a plate, what sort of supporting food system would produce that, or what shopping looks like. Does it mean going for the centralized, efficient supermarket perspective? Does it mean small-scale local shops and markets? Does it mean a hybrid of the two? So, as I said, there's different visions of all of these. And I think this is again a simplistic sort of rendition of the situation, but you get these competing narratives going on. So on the one hand, at the bottom right, you have the kind of mainstream business approach, which says, look, we've got more people on the planet, we've got to feed them all, we've got to do this on existing land without using more resources. The way to go is to be really, really efficient about it. And that means, for example, so we have something called sustainable intensification, which is based on increasing yields of crops, going for things like chickens, which have a high feed conversion efficiency, feed them with grains. You produce a lot of meat, especially if you breed them to fatten up very quickly, and you confine them so that they're not wasting energy moving around. If we have to squeeze our footprint into as small a space as possible in order to produce the food that we want to eat and that we cannot change. That's one approach. Another approach is to say, well, yeah, that we agree that's the way we need to go. We can't change people's consumption patterns, but why don't we just bypass the animal altogether and go for the high-tech in vitro meat, novel proteins, that approach, where we're actually looking at trying to take food out of the field and into the lab. Another approach is to say, well, why don't we try and integrate ourselves more with nature and have more of a sort of, rather than seeing it as an us and then, where we're producing food here and leaving land for nature, why don't we exist in a harmonious traditional fashion through organic farming, rearing animals on land unsuited to other purposes, integrating crop and livestock production more, being a bit more extensive. That's another vision. And then the final one is to say, you know, well, we don't need animals at all. We should be focusing more on a vegetarian or a vegan future. And for all of these, you can see there's a particular aesthetics, a vision of what the countryside might look like, what food might look like on our plates. And that's, aesthetics is so strong, but it's often very unspoken in the arguments that people make. But with all these visions, I think we also need to think about how we actually measure the impacts, and which dimensions of sustainability we're prioritising. You know, traditionally the environmental community life cycle assessment have done a lot of work trying to find ways of capturing and quantifying the environmental impacts of production and distribution and consumption. Some of them are less well developed, like measuring biodiversity. We're getting some understanding of how you measure food security. It's not just about calorie availability, it's affordability, access, stability over time. There's no good being on average food secure if you can't eat in February. Nutrition, again, you've got quite a lot of work there. This aspect is less developed. I mean, we have to think about what sort of jobs we value, what sort of jobs we think are worthwhile, and things like incomes. How expensive should food be? Is expensive food a good thing, or is expensive food a bad thing? It sort of depends where you are in the world and what your underpinning economic system might be. Animal welfare, again, there's a popular vision that if animals are running around in fields, that's good welfare. But somebody else might turn around and say, well, they can die of cold, they cannot be adequately nourished, you get problems of hierarchies developing among some, chickens. So again, how we measure welfare is not cut and dried. And then the culture stuff, I don't know where we are with that, but the idea that if something is traditional, then we have to hang on to it. Again, do we? Is that, if meat has traditionally always been consumed, does that mean we can't question it? So those are sort of opening up some questions. I think there's a general agreement that if we're moving towards a sustainable diet, it needs also to feed us effectively. So the question is, what is that relationship between health and sustainability? And I think you can't get away from the fact that less meat will be an important part of any story. So going back to that kind of poultry futures idea, the very efficient one, I have real trouble seeing how that could actually work. There might be a miracle, but I cannot see how we're going to meet our climate targets if we continue that sort of narrative. And this was just a systematic review that pretty much just shows that the greatest reductions come from diets where, with some exceptions, and depending what substitute foods you consume, the greatest reductions come from diets which has the least meat. But even if you're reducing your intake to one that's more balanced and not eating at excess calories, you're going to achieve some savings. That's sort of theoretical model diets. This was done by a colleague of mine, and he just looked at the real life diets of real life people following an epidemiological studies, and lo and behold finds that diets which contain fewest meat in real life also have fewest emissions. This is some sort of very large-scale global modelling studies which find a correlation, which is not the same as a. Oh, thank you. I'm just falling apart. Between diets that have that tend to be more vegetarian, and improvements in greenhouse gas emissions, improvements in reduced risk of diabetes, etc., etc. They're very, very approximate. They're just putting two studies together and showing an association. So you can't say there's a causal connection. This was another study done by colleagues of mine, which again makes the point that diets that have less meat, you have higher risk of higher benefits in terms of avoided deaths and greater emission reductions. That's a very, very simplistic study, that, because it doesn't take into account things like micronutrient deficiency. So I would look at all of those with great caution. However, the more detailed studies do find that you can create a sort of best fit, diets that are nutritionally balanced and that achieve reductions in emissions through a linear optimization approach. It's kind of best nutritional value for climate money, and you find that you can achieve something like a 40% reduction. There was a French study that came to a similar point. And then this is a study done by Ellen, who's in the audience, is going to be speaking next, which really tried to look at how you would make the best use of land in Sweden, assuming a global per capita fair shares of the allowable emissions space, and finds that you can have a nutritionally adequate diet, but you're getting very, very little meat to eat on that sort of a diet. And it's based on the land available. You know, how do we make the best use of the land available? So to conclude that bit, essentially, a diet, you can have diets that are healthy but not sustainable, and vice versa. And I'm just talking about greenhouse gas emissions here. I'm not talking about water or other factors. But the general direction of travel is don't eat more than you need, eat more diverse foods, eat more field-grown tubers, grains, legumes, cut back a lot on the meat and the dairy products, and limit foods high in processed foods and so forth. So some questions really. Firstly is, can the arts and design community bring these abstractions to life? What do these look like? How can we think about them? What happens when they're trade-offs? How can we start to envisage what those trade-offs might be if you were to live them? How can we start to be more open about the assumptions that we bring to discussions about food, and discuss in which values are important to us, and how can we engage people in the important. When I mean Cinderella issues, I mean climate change. People think about climate change, it's high in the priority, but things like biodiversity tend to get forgotten, and we think about polar bears and leopards and things like that, but it's the bugs, it's the uninteresting ones. How can we actually make them more important and get people to understand their intrinsic importance? And also, you know, you can have sustainable diets in theory and all the rest of it, but then how do we shift our consumption patterns? And I think the first thing, and this is where the scientific community have been so wrong up until now, that there's this idea that we produce the information and the knowledge, and then we just tell people, and then they'll say, oh yeah, right, okay, so that will do that. But of course, we don't choose our diets, not to. Perhaps the more affluent and the more educated you are, the more responsibility you have for the choices you make. But in general, we eat what's available, what's affordable. We eat. There are influences like environmental change that's going to influence the availability of different kinds of foods, the marketing power of corporations, national and regional planning policies, which influence the siting of shops and supermarkets and your accessibility to them, demographic incomes. As incomes change, as we become more urbanized, that will influence what's available, what we want. Civil society campaigning is also having increasingly an influence, and they in turn influence things like the price, the social norms, technology. I'm always amazed by the fact that You know, when I make my children a birthday cake, I use white flour, I use eggs, I use sugar, I use a mixer to mix it up, I put it in an oven that is totally reliable. And these things I just take for granted, but they're only there because of this massive amount of technology. And you read some of the old books and, you know, the luxury of having white flour and fresh eggs and a sweetener and an oven. You know, we take these things for granted, but these things they influence what we consume. And then, of course, you've got things like personal preferences, religious beliefs, what your family's brought you up to. And only, you know, that's when it comes a little bit more personal, a bit more considered. But the idea of individual choice is a fallacy, and that's why it's important not to think that, you know, if we just get the information out there, it'll be all right. And this is just another way of looking at it, all the different things that influence our consumption and the food that we prepare for our family and our friends. So I think this is really pretty much my penultimate slide. I think how, and this is a very open afternoon, but these were just some of my initial thoughts. I think the role of the arts and design community is to show how people bring their own values and ideologies to the debate. We highlight different visions and see if we can imagine them, smell them, touch them, taste them, and see what the lived experience might be, but also how we can motivate and inspire people. And I've presented a picture which is a picture of complexity, but you know, that way madness lies. We need to acknowledge the nuance and the complexity, but we also need to find some pathways through it, and acknowledging that the future will never be perfect and it will never be one thing or another thing. It'll usually be a mixture. But I think this is something, this combination of simplicity yet complexity is something that the design communities engage with all the time. So that's me really. I just to conclude by saying the Food Climate Research Network, as Marie has said, has been going for about 11 years. It's based at Oxford. Everyone's welcome, and please do join.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tara. And save your questions for after the next two speakers for Tara.